Hello and welcome to Recurrent Patterns, where we look for interesting patterns in technology, business, and culture. I'm your host, Václav Vinčálek. Today on Recurrent Patterns, we will be talking about, well, we will find out exactly what we will be talking, but it's the past, the future, and the patterns which might connect them. And with me here today is my very, very special guest, David Brin. He is a scientist, futurist, and of course, best-selling author of so many sci-fis that it would take us more than half an hour to list even half of these things which David wrote. Welcome to the show, David.
It's nice to be here, Václav, and greetings to your very, very sapient, sentient, and intelligent audience.
Well, thank you very much for that. So, David, I mentioned that you are a scientist, futurist, you write sci-fi, you are a public speaker. In the context of our conversations, what do you want to be today?
Well, you know, I'm of the belief that people are large. And this is what I say when I give commencement addresses to, you know, graduating seniors at both colleges and high schools, is that the most important concept for us to really grasp in this civilization is the positive sum game. The idea that 1 plus 1 could equal 10 or 1,000. If you add people together in the right way, or you add your talents together in the right way, you can be larger than the sum of your parts. And throughout history, people were told in most civilizations, and they're still told by parts of this civilization, you must choose to be one thing, a Republican or a Democrat, a conservative or a liberal, a nerdy STEM type, or someone who understands art, or someone who understands history. And it's a flat out lie. I studied hard to become an astrophysicist. I got my union card, my credentials, my pile higher and deeper PhD, and I'm still involved. I still do some science, and I'm involved with NASA's Innovative and Advanced Concepts program, which gives seed grants to researchers trying to develop new technologies that are just this side of science fiction. But I always knew that I came from a writer's family, going back generations, and I always knew I would write. I wanted to be part of this civilization's truth-seeking network, because no other civilization ever had one like this, and we support, you know, 1 million scientists, several million scientific or technological workers, including those on the heroic front of this fight against a pandemic right now. I wanted to be part of that because for the first time, a civilization was actually caring about what was true and not what they convinced themselves with their incantations ought to be true. But I also knew that I was a story spinner. So I went on, and civilization pays me much more to blab and write books and spin stories than it ever paid me to be a truth seeker, and that's okay. Society, civilization outvotes me. That's fine. I get a nice office like this, and people pat me on the head and say, "Oh, wasn't that a nice thing you did?"
They must pat a lot, I know.
Yeah, but the point is that we are large. And in my commencement address, I tell people, you know, about how, in my long life, I've met many brilliant people, and all of the most brilliant scientists I've known had an artistic hobby that they pursued at almost a professional level. My father told me that he took me to see Einstein play the violin when I was 4. I don't remember it, but
that's what
you know, Richard Feynman was world's greatest bongos player. What the heck? He also stole my date at a dance. I was 20 years old. I was very happy about that. I mean, who gets to tell stories like that? Who gets to say, Richard Feynman stole my date at a dance. I've been a lucky guy. And that's why I'm so loyal to this civilization. And that comes out in some of my novels, like The Postman, which Kevin Costner made into the movie. And the one thing that he really conveyed very well, while scooping out and throwing away all the brains from my book, was the heart message of gratitude for getting to live in a civilization like this, one that really deserves our loyalty. So I don't know if I answered your question successfully, but as far as historical patterns are concerned, let me leap to your question. I'm a consultant with the Pattern Computer Company, which is trying to develop computers that are like the human optic nerve. They notice patterns before it even becomes aware to the computer that there's something there or a problem to be worked on. And that's what our optic nerve does for us. When it moves, the signals move from the retina back to the sight centers at the back of the brain. The optic nerve sifts for basic patterns, and then more patterns, and then more patterns. And so the Pattern Computer Company is doing that. And that's what we do. We seek patterns, and that's the name of your podcast, is pattern. You're about pattern seeking. And if you ask me, I will explain why pattern seeking across history is both devastatingly misleading and absolutely necessary for us to find our way ahead in this crisis era.
Yes, and perfect. Well, that's exactly what I was looking for. And so let me read here this on your blog post or your blog website, which you wrote on Sunday, November 1st, 2009. And
you will put a link underneath.
Totally.
Yeah, totally. All right.
You will get all the links there because I think it's absolutely essential because based on my patterns, when the conversations which we had in past, one has to spend for every, 10, 15, 20 minutes of conversation with you, you have to spend then several hours just read up on all the things which we were talking, right? So this is just a teaser to what people should be reading. And so this in this blog post, and I think that's exactly what you just described, is that there's a quote that history, not your quote, that history runs in patterns and even predictable cycles. And that's the dangerous part because then it sounds like it's deterministic and there's no way around it. It will always happen like this. But at the same time, I would submit to you that we can learn from patterns from history, not to repeat perhaps the same mistakes, or to see if we would do something like this, we will be able to avoid that, or we can do something better than we've done in past. So I think that would be your analogy, that we should learn from past, identifying the right pattern, and then move to the future.
Well, a friend of mine, Joe Miller, took the famous quotation from Santayana. Now, Santayana said, "Those who ignore the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them." A cynical snark that's going around right now is those who do learn from the lessons of history are doomed to watch helplessly as their neighbors repeat them, the mistakes of history. A friend of mine, Joe Miller, appended that to say, those who ignore the mistakes of the future are doomed to make them. And so that's a way of saying, read more science fiction. Because the job of science fiction, I'm talking high-end science fiction that seriously does rumination and thinking about history, the great story, the saga that is the central saga of all humanity, is our stumbling out of the mud in the caves and crawling up, making horrible, often well-meaning mistakes and replacing experimental determined facts with incantations, magical incantations, and that's happening so much nowadays. And that's why science fiction, the best science fiction, shouldn't be called science fiction. It should be called speculative history, speculating about the past, about alternate possible realities, about where history's trends might take us in the future if we make mistakes or if we somehow avoid the worst of them and reach for the stars and make children who are as much better than us as we are better than our grandparents, and we are, because they succeeded, or at least a lot of us are. You have to bear in mind that if speculative history is a better description of the best end of science fiction, then the best science fiction doesn't try to predict. Now, I have excellent prediction scores according to all these sites and things that map things out and do ratings and all that. My novel Earth Alone has a wiki tracking its predictions that have eerily come true. Whee! But that's not my job. The highest form of science fiction is not the predictive science fiction, but the preventive, the self-preventing prophecy. For example, millions of environmentalists were recruited by stories like Soylent Green, like Silent Running, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, by those dire warnings. And because of those dire warnings, John Brunner's The Sheep Look Up, because of those dire warnings, we have a chance. There's a really active world community of young people and old farts like me who were at the first Earth Day, who are pushing for us to have a chance to save this world. That's one example of self-preventing prophecy. Another is nuclear war. Retired officers later admitted that they changed procedures because they were scared of the things that they saw in movies like Dr. Strangelove, War Games, On the Beach, Failsafe. And given how close we came many times, arguably we were saved by science fiction. And the granddaddy of all self-preventing prophecies, 1984 by George Orwell, which inspired millions, tens of millions, to watch out for a return of feudal power, the pyramid of privilege in which lords and kings and priests could dominate everyone, only this time empowered by new technologies to slam an iron boot in our face for the rest of time. And the main difference in normal times between a decent Democrat and a decent conservative is which direction they think is trying to become Big Brother. Is it snooty academics and faceless government bureaucrats? Is it conniving aristocrats and oligarchs and faceless corporations? Well, in fact, it could be any of those. And in normal times, we guard each other's backs with our suspicions. But these are not normal times. This sense of suspicion of authority, which pervades all Hollywood films, all of them. Suspicion of authority, tolerance, diversity, individual eccentricity of the protagonist. These are memes that you find in almost all Hollywood films. And they've been turned against us because propaganda out there is saying to the right, only pay attention to those possible big brothers. Pay no attention to the elites who are pulling your puppet strings. And to a lesser extent, but definitely true, the same thing is happening to folks on the left. They're given tunnel vision. So that's part of our problem, and it's part of the problem with pattern seeking. Now, you asked about historical patterns, and I led off with Santayana's quote and then leading into variations on that quote. And that led into the notion that science fiction's job is not so much to predict, although it helps. It's a good service that science fiction performs, but trying to help us prevent. What this runs up against is our, what is it called? Pareidolia, the tendency of human beings to see patterns because we want to see them.
Yes, and this is very similar to, I don't know exactly that word, but I can tell you as a pilot, there is this phenomena where you flying, and it's especially in unknown terrain in mountains, and you suddenly get lost. And then you pull a map, and then you try to make the surroundings look exactly like the map. And you try to convince yourself, oh, this is the hill that's exactly on my map. And that's the worst kind of, because that's usually, because then you run out of fuel and you die, right? So that's exactly, you're trying to convince yourself that you see something and you try so hard that at the end you believe it and you die.
And this is a human tendency that, as a scientist, scientists are all trained to watch out for this. The sacred catechism of the priesthood of science is, I might be wrong, so let's find out. Let's double check. What that has enabled us to do as scientists is to eliminate maybe half of the errors we would naturally make. Now that's incredible. That's stunning. That's amazing. That's unprecedented in human history, and it's not enough because we still fool ourselves. So the real innovation is the one that Adam Smith talked about. Adam Smith is terribly misunderstood. People think that he was talking about social Darwinism and let the poor hang and all that sort of thing. He was actually a deeply moral person. He wrote, in addition to the theory of wealth of nations, he also wrote the theory of human sentiments, and was deeply moral person. He recognized, though, that competition is the great antidote to error because of the fundamental human trait, and that is delusion. I will delude myself because it feels good to think certain things.
Yes, of course.
You will delude yourself. How do we get past this delusion? Well, when we had these pyramidal social structures of kings and priests and lords dominating everyone, what they would do is they would kill their critics in order to stay in power. And that guaranteed that they would be very bad at statecraft. They would rule stupidly, and that explains this story that's called history, which is a story of one grotesque stupidity after another, over and over and over again on all continents. Because criticism is the only known antidote to error. Cito Kate. And if criticism is the only known antidote to error, then what Adam Smith said is the only way to get enough criticism so that you make fewer mistakes is in markets. Competition that's fair, that's flat. And that means you flatten that pyramid of power so that nobody can repress their critics, and everyone has to compete fairly. When it comes to products and goods and services, they have to compete in markets. When it comes to policy, they have to compete or negotiate in democracy. In courts, you find out what's true through an adversarial process between the defense and the prosecution, or the plaintiff and the respondent. In science, the most competitive of all fields, scientists are the most competitive humans our species ever made. And that's why this whole war on science insanity of saying scientists are like lemmings, they're all copying each other, is completely insane. These people never met a scientist. They would never some of them would knife each other in the back. They would go down the middle of the street with evidence that they found in their experiments and shoot everybody else's theory. They're Top Guns strolling down Main Street. And then the fifth arena, we talked about markets, democracy, science, justice courts, is sports. And what sports shows is perfectly well what is a trait of all of these competitive arenas. And that is human beings will cheat if they possibly can. And they'll cheat based on their delusions, which we were talking about. If you were to remove all regulations from a sports league one Saturday, including the regulations against murder, by the end of the day, the sports league would not be non-existent. There'd be dead bodies everywhere, and everyone would be sick, everything would be over, and the owners' franchises would be worthless, and the teams income would be worthless, and the spectators would have thrown up. Sports only works because of very tight regulation, and the regulation itself is closely supervised by the fans. The same is true of markets, democracy, science, especially justice courts, very tightly regulated. Liberals have a tendency to have a reflex against competition. The word competition, it sounds not very nice. Conservatives tend to, the word regulation, when in fact it is only regulated competition that defeats cheating, because humans will cheat. And we're seeing that happen to our institutions. We're seeing it destroying the fecundity in this and the ability of markets and democracy to function. So to come around full circle, we are delusional. So how do we get past this basic human trait? Your delusion is not the same as my delusion. You can see my delusion, even if I can't. I can see yours. Criticism is the only known antidote to error. Your critics, your enemies, will point out the flaws in your policy or your theory or whatever, and they'll do it for free. Your enemies will criticize you, which, if you look at it right, is the greatest favor they could do for you. They will help you to refine your theory or your product by pointing out its flaws. And if you look at it that way, they are helping you to defeat them.
Yes.
Your proper attitude towards people who criticize you is either, all right, that's bullshit, that's wrong. You know what? I'm going to fix that. Thanks a lot. Thanks for helping me defeat you. I'm going to fix that. Thanks. And now I will return the favor by criticizing you.
And you mentioned something very, very important, and I think this is, there are many things which are, I don't want to say wrong today, but what people get too focused on, and it's rather than discussing the ideas, the topics exactly as you did right now, we tend to go into labeling. And then by labeling, we by default assume all the stereotypes which comes with that label. I didn't meet yet American who within a few moments immediately says, okay, I'm either Democrat or Republican, or there are very few who are in the middle, but everybody's very, I'm always Democrat, or I'm always Republican. And rather than focusing really on the topic for discussion.
Well, what you're talking about is the normal process of politics. Politics is a word that has had very, very ill repute. We've been taught to look at it in ill repute. And nobody wants politics to have a bad name more than our enemies. Because politics is actually a noble process of sausage making. The old story, those who love sausage and the law should never watch either one being made. Because it's, of course, going to be disgusting. It's going to be filled with negotiations and some corruption and compromises and flaws. And it just happens to be better than absolutely anything else that humans ever did. Now, politics in normal times, party was secondary. I remember when your political party was secondary and the person you elected to Congress figured it was his job, and it was almost always a he, to negotiate, to actually pass laws. Since 2001 especially, except for 1 2-year period, the Congress of the United States has passed almost no laws, held almost no hearings that weren't about investigating Clintons. and issued almost no subpoenas that weren't about investigating Clintons, and broke all records in fundraising. The number of days in session of Republican Congresses has been almost non-existent. To call this an equal failure on both sides is easily refuted, because it was Dennis Hastert who ousted Newt Gingrich as Speaker of the House. Newt Gingrich, even though he was a warrior for the Republicans, a very powerful warrior, and he waged real war, and there were a lot of flaws to him, but he thought the job was to come up with laws. And so he negotiated with Bill Clinton for welfare reform and for the Budget Act that resulted in surpluses. And for the crime of negotiating, he was ousted by Dennis Hastert, H-A-S-T-E-R-T. People should look him up. And I need say no more, just look at the Wikipedia article about this fellow who the Republicans made Speaker of the House and head of the Republican Party. And the Hastert rule that he enforced fiercely was no Republican may ever again negotiate with a Democrat over anything. Now, it was explicit that the parties were unequal about this. Obama kept trying to negotiate. It was a character flaw on his part, actually. So this is not equal. We are in phase 8 of the American Civil War. And under those conditions, politics has been destroyed. It doesn't exist. Not in the real sense of the word of all parties bringing together their interest groups to the table and negotiating in good faith to make new laws for an improving republic. Almost no laws have passed since 2001, except for a few in the years 2009 and 2010. Under these conditions, when you're in a phase of civil war, politics isn't the issue. It's who's going to win the war. And in every other phase of the Civil War, and it goes back not to the 1860s, that was phase 4 of the American Civil War. It goes back to 1778, when Cornwallis came to the South, as you see in the Mel Gibson movie, The Patriot, because he knew there would be more Tories, there would be more locals supporting the king, because the South was inherently more romantic. Conservative, yes, but the key word is romantic. Mark Twain blamed the Civil War on the medievalist, feudalist novels of Sir Walter Scott, which were absorbed by every white person in the South. And it was very romantic, and that's why the plantation lords duplicated the feudal manor system. But to get back to the notion of cycles, because that's what you're asking me about, is patterns. That 2009 essay that you're linking to was about this notion of pattern seeking in history. And it's not just conservatives who seek these patterns. Leftists do as well. The difference is that leftists, especially Marxists, tend to see a pattern of continuous, historically demanded rise of human civilization. They don't see it happening necessarily through Adam Smith's give and take of all these markets. The Marxists thought it would happen. The markets would fail, as they are failing right now. Marx, we thought, relegated to the dustbin of history, but because of what's been happening the last 10, 15 years and the incredible wealth disparities, Marx's books are flying off the shelves on university campuses again. He's been resurrected.
Yeah, you don't have to tell me much about that, because I grew up in time where I had to memorize all these things. And
yes.
I remember how ridiculous that sounded even at that time when I had to study that. And not only I had to study, I had to repeat it as I believe it. That was that's the story.
What a lot of Republicans refuse to recognize is that Vladimir Putin simply continued the KGB under a different name. He and his oligarchs were all former commissars, raised on Leninist catechisms. And what they have created in Russia is exactly the Soviet system with different labels and names.
Yes.
The oligarchs are commissars running state corporations. It's just they get to be flaunted and call themselves mafia billionaires because that sells well on the American right. They gave up after 70 years trying to suborn the American left with Marxist symbols, hammers and sickles, and talk of the proletarian masses and the workers. It never worked. But as soon as they got rid of the hammers and sickles and put on Orthodox crosses and started talking like mafiosi, the same exact people in the KGB, which became the GRU and the FSB, the same exact people using the same exact tactics with the same exact goal of bringing down the West. They quickly suborned the American right. And it's absolutely amazing. But to get back to patterns, the left has a tendency to see these patterns as historical inevitability. It's called teleology, T-E-L-E-O-G-Y, the notion that the future is foreordained. The right is romantically wed to the notion that everything must repeat, that any arrogant belief that we can climb is doomed because civilization becomes decadent. People become lazy. They betray the vigor of their grandparents. And inevitably, the society crashes down to slavery again, which suffering invigorates those grandchildren and makes them strong so that they eventually rebel and rise and have vigor and build civilization again. This cyclical notion is proof that the fascists and Nazis were a right-wing phenomenon, despite the name socialist being in their slogan, because the Hornbigger cult, promoted by Goebbels and Hitler and Himmler and the rest, this was totally a cyclical notion that moons of ice crash into the earth now and then and create ice ages in which stern, noble Nordic people rise up and gain their vigor back again. It was totally what the Nazis believed. Oswald Spengler in the 1920s had a book called Decline of the West, in which he said that the West was doomed to dissipate because of its decadence by 1930. And of course, our greatest days were ahead. The latest version is a book called The Fourth Turning by Strauss and Howe. And so many of my conservative friends are absolutely in love with it. It does pattern recognition, which is that it was 80 years, 7 years ago, between the American Revolution and the Civil War. And 80 years from the Civil War to the crisis of World War II, and another 80 years from World War II until Steve Bannon predicts the great crisis will slam us in a couple of years. Ignoring the fact that he is bending every effort on earth to organize an oligarchy to ensure that the crisis happens, and it would not have happened without them. We were doing great in the 90s. Steve Bannon also ignores the fact that he's a freaking boomer like me. Therefore, one of the bad generation. And if you ask the millennials, who are wonderful people, by the way, and I take full credit because I raised several of them, they are much better people than boomers. They're capable of being heroes. They might even be required to be a hero generation, as happened before. But they hate Steve Bannon. They hate him and they hate everything he stands for. So what exactly is he trying to say? In any event, Strauss and Howe, it's pattern recognition bullshit. It's complete crap, really, really easily disproved. It's nonsense. But the thing about it that is most horrible is that it tries to be self-reinforcing, self-fulfilling. And we don't need that right now. A crisis of collapse on the scale of World War II right now would probably lead to extinction of our present civilization. It would certainly lead to a crisis that would destroy the confidence of democratic civilization so that the plot to return us to feudalism would succeed. Because that's what happens when fear is rampant, is women forget their rights, they stay by the hearth, and people forget about luxuries like democracy. And that's why the far right loves this stuff. No, let me tell you something that looks similar to pattern recognition, but isn't. And that's attractor states. There are strong equilibrium conditions that will repeatedly try to draw in any system. For instance, the cycles of summer and winter will have a tendency to draw the Gulf Stream in. These cycles can change depending upon how the system's getting weighted. So now that the Arctic is warm and staying liquid, that is pushing freezing winter air down, and we are having ice storms in spring in America, which of course proves there's no such thing as global warming. Well, go and measure the temperature of the Arctic. Attractor states are not repeating cyclical patterns. They are representatives of forces that push in a certain direction. And the great attractor state, if you look at 6,000 years of human history, the great attractor state is feudalism. Why? Because on all continents except Australia, wherever humans discovered agriculture, and you didn't even need iron because in America they mostly did it with stone tools, vicious large males would gang together in gangs, pick up these cudgels, and kill other men and take their women and wheat. It's what you and I might do under similar circumstances, and we know it. We're all descended from the harems of guys who did that, who got away with that crap. So that explains why males have these incredible fantasies, harems and things like that. Because we all think we deserve it because we're descended from these bastards. Now, we can, as individual males, overcome these. My wife tells me that I'm not responsible for, and she doesn't care that much about what goes on inside here. As long as my external behavior is A-okay,
yes,
then
presentable. Then
she's okay with my jungle going on in here. Wise woman. It's a compromise I can live with. The point is that it takes a society, a civilization, to prevent the natural drift back into this, because Darwin would tell you that this is a reinforcing attractor state. The guys who picked up these metal implements and took other men's women and wheat had more reproductive success. And so feudalism probably happens all across the galaxy. And under feudalism, you have repression of criticism, because that helps you stay in power and make sure your spoiled brat son gets to have other men's women and wheat too, even though he did nothing to earn it. This is why even in Ayn Rand novels, the real villains aren't socialists, it's inherited wealth. You got to give that to her, even though she was out of her freaking mind. Try looking at Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged again. It's the real villains are the inheritance brats. The point is that this is an attractor state, and it will draw society back into feudalism unless we resist. In Periclean Athens, I recommend people read Thucydides about the Peloponnesian War. And it's about the rise of Athens. And you read the funeral oration by the great Pericles, as related by Thucydides. And you read Pericles' words, and you realize this is a guy who was like Benjamin Franklin 250 years earlier, 230 years earlier. It's just jaw-dropping, where he's talking about people holding each other accountable and finding each other's mistakes, and through argumentation, forming something that's more creative. And it was absolutely true. For 2 generations, the Athenian democracy was more creative, more dynamic, more robust, more resilient than anything all the oligarchies and kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean had ever seen before. Absolutely resilient and just absolutely overcame all obstacles. This is why I hate that movie, The 300.
Yeah, I remember you very strongly came against that movie.
Yeah. Vaclav will link to where I take down that absolutely wretched, horrible pack of lies. The Spartans never achieved anything in 20 battles, in 20 wars, compared to what the Athenians did on that one beach, at Marathon. And those were butchers and bakers and candlestick makers. But here's the problem. Democracy is not stable. It's a diamond-shaped social structure in which a well-off middle class is unafraid of the rich and outnumbers the poor, and is dynamic and churning and constantly meritocratic, and you rise up, as Adam Smith recommended, by dint of your creativity. And no child is so poor that he or she can't, well, in Athens, all right, it was flawed. It was only he and only the sons of citizens. We can talk about the flaws of democracy later. But the point is, it was dynamic, but the diamond is unstable. And Athens started making populist mistakes, as we are doing now. The same thing happened in Florence, the great experiment in Florence, Machiavelli's Florence. And the same thing is happening now, only across the last 250 years and across 8 phases of the American Civil War, we've kept this experiment alive in a diamond-shaped social structure, a democracy in which every generation, with great pain, expanded the circle of those who were included and who could talk by the council fire. Jefferson knew, Washington knew the job was 5% done, but it was a very important 5%. And we've done another 5-10% in our lifetimes. And it's not done till we get Star Trek.
Yes. The other kind of the book which I know you wrote and you frequently talk about, because when people watch this conversation, they would say, okay, so what can be done or how things can be changed. And I think you very nicely touch on it in the transparent society. Well, as I was saying, right? And I think that's, you know, I'm more on the, let's say, technology side, computer side, and I can see all the pros and cons of technology, when what it can do for you, and also how it can spy on you and everything. But to turn it and really make it transparent, everything what's happening, to like it's in open. So it will encourage what you were alluding to is always debate. It encourages disagreement or argument about things, but in open. So people cannot hide behind various regulations and rules, which everything is protected, everything is private. And I think that's what the Transparent Society is talking about.
Well, yes, I wrote it in 1998, shortly after I talked about some of the same ideas in my novel, Earth. And that is, remember I mentioned 5 great competitive arenas that are following Adam Smith's recommendation of flat, fair, accountable competition. Very flawed. And 2 of them are suffering right now from cheating. Well, what enables cheating? And that is darkness, lack of information, lack of accountability. And all of these 5 arenas, democracy, science, justice courts, markets, and sports, all do worse when the participants don't know what's going on. And when citizens know what's going on, democracy works better. When purchasers and normal people know what's going on, markets work better. And oligarchs will always try to come up with some excuse for why we should not know what's going on. Now, the argument over transparency is very complicated. Basically, what it comes down to is turning around the telescreen, which is the method of control in 1984, in Orwell's 1984. The book changes if all the proletariat can look at Big Brother and all the party members at all times, just like they can look at the proletariats, even in the bathroom. Now, even if the party has all the guns, if they are observed and all their conversations are observed all the time by the people, you bet that society is going to be different. Now, that's an extreme, but it raises the idea of the concept of surveillance. Surveillance is coming whether you like it or not. The elites of this world are going to know everything because there's Brin's corollary to Moore's law. And that is the cameras get faster, cheaper, better, vastly more numerous, and more mobile every year. And nothing is going to stop that. I have friends in the Electronic Frontier Foundation in the ACLU, and I urge all of your listeners to join. Because if you join the ACLU and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, then your small dues go towards them hiring techies and lawyers on a par with any corporation. And they will fight for you. They are fighting for you now. But I disagree with them about one fundamental, and that is that the way to prevent Big Brother is by hiding from him. It's not going to work. It will not work. You cannot name one time in the history of the world in which elites were stymied for very long from a method of seeing. We're monkeys. They're elites, enough said. These notion of restricting or banning face recognition systems, oh my God, You actually think you're going to, they are already on our phones. They're already apps.
Yes, we're using it to open the phone.
One thing has ever stymied face recognition. Vaclav, can you guess what it is? COVID-19.
Right. With the facial masks, right?
That's right, and that won't last. The point is that I'm not saying give up. You can deter what the elites might do to you. That's so much more important than what they know about you. If the elites are going to know stuff about you, no matter what, but if you can stop them from doing anything to you, ever, then you're okay. And there's only one way to stop them from doing things to you, and that is to know about them. The more light gets through the world, the less elites can actively do to you because you catch them in the act. The same is true of privacy. The only hope privacy has is in a mostly transparent world if you can catch the peeping Toms and the voyeurs. It's what we do in restaurants. You glance from side to side, if we ever get restaurants back. You glance from side to side and you check every now and then to make sure no one's leaning in and listening. That is how we stay free, and that's how we'll keep some privacy. In any event, I don't expect to convince anybody now. I don't expect to convince you of this, but you should at least consider the possibility that it's a way of looking at things. Do you remember that silly movie, Tom Hanks movie, The Circle, based upon a very silly book that actually referenced me a couple times? So I take it personally. The guy assaulted my transparency thing without ever understanding it. There's a scene in which a very shy fellow is asking his ex-girlfriend to stop posting about him because he's shy and he just wants his privacy. And she's bought into this whole, sharing is caring and privacy is theft exaggeration that this author Eggers puts into this silly novel. Well, in the movie, her compatriots at this company come up with their phones and they are recording the evil shy person begging for a little privacy because it's a terrible thing. So that's an extreme version of what I recommend about transparency. Now, what was the director and the author trying to accomplish with that scene? Generate revulsion in the audience. You who saw the scene, you were revolted by the behavior of those people. And yet the assumption is that nobody within 50 feet watching this scene would feel similarly revolted. What would you do? Well, you do as people are now doing when cops and Ku Klux Klanners abuse black joggers. They're taking pictures of the bad guys. I would have loved to see the camera pull back and show someone else taking pictures of the people who are taking pictures of the shy fellow, saying, look at these bastards. All he wants to do is be left alone, and look at them bullying him. I'm going to send these pictures to their moms. Who the hell raised you? See, always do that. Always step back and say, what reaction is the filmmaker trying to evoke from me? And like in the movie Avatar, or subtitled Dances with Very Tall Smurfs. In this allegory, we're not talking about the past like in Dances with Wolves or Fern Gully. We're talking about the human future. And those people in that human future never watched Avatar? They never watched movies like Avatar? They could actually behave in that way? Well, that's a pretty nasty view of our grandchildren. I mean, I'm all in favor of what, Cameron was trying to do and what he's trying to say, the lesson he's trying to preach. But he didn't have to preach in addition to, here's something that could go wrong, let's not make this happen. He didn't have to say, it's inevitable. And that takes us full circle back to the notion of patterns that, are they inevitable? Are they? Well, these attractor states pull toward things. It could be cyclical, but not because there's something inherent in the rise and fall of civilizations. Strauss and the Tytler calumny, they act as if this sort of thing has happened in history. It hasn't. Western civilization fell once. Now, empires and kingdoms fell. Dynasties especially fell because, yes, the grandsons of a vigorous king were often inbred schmucks. But the civilization didn't fall because of decadence of the peasants. The one thing that makes a big difference is if you tell the lords, get bent. That's how Game of Thrones should have ended. All the lordly families. Jon Snow should have been told, okay, we'll leave you and your sister alive. You can come south once a year and open Parliament. That's it. We see you any other time of the year, you're dead. That is our revolution. And that's the betrayal that we get from romantic fictions that pay no attention to the simple fact that we have to stop being ingrates. We have to start recognizing this right now is the best time humanity ever had. And if we succeed at stymieing the current oligarchic putsch, if the American eighth phase of civil war goes right, if we can get out into the solar system and do better than the Expanse, if we can keep this revolution, this Periclean revolution alive, then we may inherit the stars. We may be the wise old, the ancient ones.
Yep.
And may I point out that Vaclav will have a link to this. This is my latest novel. It's a comedy. And if you go to the websites that he will cite, there are free chapters of both of these books that you can download and sample. And if you don't find the first 3 chapters of this one funny, don't buy the book.
There's something wrong with you.
No, not when it comes to humor. No, there's something wrong with me.
Okay.
Did Brin actually think that was funny? So.
I always find you funny.
All right.
Okay, so David, I really, really appreciate the conversation as always. Now I have another 2 weeks of studying because I have to, all the references which you mentioned, I have to read upon because I knew probably half of it if I'm lucky. And so thank you everybody for watching. I'm sure that you enjoy that. Yes, all the information from David will be below the video in all the links. Thank you everybody for watching. Until next time, my name is Václav Vinčálek, and thank you David, Brin, for great conversation. Bye-bye.